Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm going to ask our panelists to turn off their videos and mute themselves right now. Again, I apologize for some technical difficulties. I didn't realize that we had a problem figuring out how to present here. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. I am new at doing this job, and our expert moderator, Joe Griffiths, is on vacation today. So thank you again for joining us. I think everyone is now in, I hope. And again, I apologize for the delay in getting started here. I've learned something. You don't share a screen right away because it takes away the start recording button. So again, apologize. So good morning and welcome to the third of 5 webinars hosted by the Maryland Department of Transportation in partnership with the Maryland Department of Planning, held on Thursdays during Walktober, a month-long series of activities and educational events to promote safe walking and walkability. My name is Chuck Boyd in the Maryland Department of Planning, and I'm serving as a moderator for this Walkinar, and I'm learning as I go. Again, apologize about that. Maryland Department of Transportation works to advance transportation and land use planning with the goal of supporting vibrant communities, promoting safe and transportation options, connecting all Marylanders with the opportunities and each other. In May, MDOT launched their monthly MDOT in Motion, an educational series. MDOT's Walktober Walkinars, including today's, aligns with this series, which brings you timely and important information about active transportation and mobility topics. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars. By viewing this, you can go to MDOT's YouTube channel for the series. Other valuable information on MDOT's transportation planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities also available at mdot.maryland.gov. We encourage you to visit the Office of Active Transportation and Mobility's landing page, where you can subscribe to our newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. AICP viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association, and to receive those AICP credits, visit APA's website, planning.org, log into your account, search for the name of today's event, or you could search for the event number 9317962. And finally, it's important to note that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speakers and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Transportation, Maryland Department of Planning, or the state of Maryland. Now, before I introduce the speakers, we have a short video to thank one of our Walktober partners that we're highlighting today, the Hike Crew. Let's take a quick look at the Hike Crew and their efforts to promote walking.
Chuck, we're not seeing the video. There we go.
Turning I need to hear it louder. All for one.
And one for all.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, right. You know.
Yeah,
you
not
need
you.
Sorry about that. My skill set of this Walktober are always challenged along the way. Um, so let me get back to you seeing the presentation slides again, housekeeping slides.
Yes.
We do.
Good. Sorry about that. Again, always challenged by this stuff. Okay. Again, thank you much for the hike crew for your support in Walktober. Please note that some housekeeping matters that are on the for this webinar are listed on the slide. Following the presentations, our presenters will be answering as many questions as time permits. We ask that you submit your questions to the speakers at any time using the question tool. Just click on the Q&A button located in the control panel on the right side of the screen. And if you have administrative or technical questions, please use the chat function. I'll try to do my best about addressing those technical issues. We've enabled the audience to post relevant information about the topics using the chat button. But again, if you're going to ask a question, and we want to encourage you to do so, please use the question tool. We're excited about the lineup of experts today, and today we're going to hear from Bob Stearns, author of Beyond Greenways, The Next Step in City Trails and Walking Routes. Bob Stearns has a 5 decades history of visualizing, planning, and getting trails and gateway projects built. He was the project director of Denver's Platte River and Mary Carter Greenways, both of which were national award-winning projects. He played a key role in designing the Memphis Wolf Ridge Greenway, and he helped plan the Grand Canyon National Park Greenway. He serves as the national chair of the American Trails, helped found the World Trails Network, and was a delegate to President Obama's Great American Outdoors Conference. He authored Beyond Greenways, The Next Step in City Trails and Walking Routes, one of the 10 best books of 2023, according to the American Society of the Landscape Architects blog, The Dirt. And he co-authored Greenways, A Guide to Planning, Design, and Development. He currently writes for the Island Press Short Form Project. He has written for Public Square, Landscape Architect, American Trails, LA China, and Planet magazines, and the Island Press Urban Resiliency Project. He has hosted numerous webinars, a multitude of podcasts, and has been a keynote speaker as well as a trainer for the U.S. National Park Service and the American Planning Association Urban Land Institute. Welcome, Bob. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can present.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen here. I'm looking for the button. I feel your pain with the digital things. Is there? I'm looking. Oh, here we go. Let's see if this will work, folks. And there we go. I hope. Share. And there we are. Wow, amazing. Sometimes it actually works. Hopefully everybody's just seeing the slides and not too many other things on there that might be distracting. And I'd like to talk a little bit about just I think the way things are going, in terms of walkability trends and those kinds of things. And there we go. And the notion of really bringing walkability to everybody, to make every doorstep a trailhead. And look at some of these kinds of questions of getting people motivated to engage, getting infrastructure built, some maybe new, more affordable ways to do that, some trail building hacks for trying times. Needless to say, walking and bike use, trail use is the hot thing. It's something that's not just a trend. I think it's a permanent part of our culture, but we do need to have the infrastructure to do it. And to get that infrastructure built, we need to have constituencies so that we can engage the resources. Currently, about 42% of the population, it might even be higher now, are clinically obese with all the health impacts. And there's a cost to that. It's just a phenomenal number of costs for people being basically out of shape. Plus, you just don't feel good. And it's widespread, but a lot of populations in all different sectors don't participate. But particularly minority communities, lower income populations have actually 14% higher rates of these problems. And so we do need, and our goal, I think, of the Walkinars, at least part of the goal is to have safe, convenient places to walk. And those places need to be pleasant experiences where people are motivated to participate. To set sort of a framework for this, I'd like to talk about a perspective I've had of the evolution of walkability infrastructure. And also in this discussion, give a little definition of what we mean by walking, because there's so many modalities of walking. It's not just walking in the traditional sense, but hiking, running, going on treks, which are multi-day, kind of epic journeys, traveling with mobility devices for people per the ADA who need those things. And we can also think about on some of these facilities that I'm going to describe, they would accommodate single track biking and equestrian use when appropriate. I like to think of walking routes as adaptive green infrastructure. And what do we mean by that? I think throughout the history of civilization, people have wanted to find counterpoints to their day-to-day lives and some of the sometimes oppressive situations of their day-to-day lives. As Henry David Thoreau put it, those lives of quiet desperation. And Thoreau also talked about the notion of places that we can integrate nature and culture, and those places where we can kind of just get away. Everybody needs that, looks for that. And that's just, an essential part of, I think, our being and our well-being. And I've kind of perceived this as a evolution, and I'm seeing 4 stages of this. There might be other stages to evolve, but we can go back a millennia or so, and to the notion of boulevards, beginning in ancient China, where there would be places where streets, walking quarters, where in quarters of transportation that maybe were beautified a little bit to kind of give people a civic experience. Later on in places like France, we had the more classic boulevards that formed, these kind of outdoor spaces that would get you out of your house and out into places amongst people. And that then, I think, late in the 19th century, evolved into another stage, thanks to Frederick Law Olmsted and his family, who his son and nephew, who developed the parkways systems, and we have them around the nation, the U.S. now. There's a beautiful one in Buffalo, New York. Berkeley, I believe, has one. There's one in Brooklyn. The parkways were the notion of having landscape corridors, taking that boulevard notion a step further, that would link parks together. And it was a way people on a Sunday afternoon could get out and be in the greenery and with each other, and kind of a counterpoint to the day-to-day existence, the long hours in a factory or in an office. And then I think in the 70s, the 1970s, we saw another generation emerge, and this was a counterpoint, whereas the parkways maybe were a counterpoint to the industrial existence of cities. This was a counterpoint, I think, to the domination of the automobile that began to take over our urban environments beginning in the 1940s and going forward. And greenways were places that followed the grain of the landscape, if you will, following primarily linear routes along rivers, streams, rail trails, canals, where people could get into a place where, you know, cars weren't present. And many of these had the multi-use trail. Paved bike trail was a very common feature. By the way, speaking of rail trails, and you might hear a little bit more from this from other panelists, is don't miss the Rails to Trails documentary film based on Peter Harnick's book, From Rails to Trails. It's on PBS tonight, of all times, coincidentally. Anyway, back to greenways. They became a way of transforming many urban spaces that had become kind of derelict and forgotten, our drainage ways particularly, and abandoned rail corridors, into places for people and places to get that counterpoint, that green counterpoint out in nature. I think we're seeing another generation now, and this gets back to the idea of making every doorstep a trailhead, providing these spaces where more people can engage. A greenway or a rail trail, it's a wonderful feature, or even a loop trail within a park, but you have to travel to get there. And so if we want people to routinely engage for health benefits and just the benefits of that green counterpoint, can we make these things closer to people, more accessible? And so at least I started to think about this, a different geometry, that we could look at loops, which actually go against the grain of the landscape. They don't necessarily follow those pre-established linear corridors, but they're overlaid. And we can almost begin to think of these kinds of trails and walking routes as overlaid parks. And I'll get into that in a little more detail as I go along. I kind of saw maybe two aspects of this when I started thinking about this a few years ago. One was the notion of grand loops, of providing places out on the edge of town, loops that go around the edges where city meets countryside. And we can envision these as maybe they're in some cities, you can go right out to the edge. There's one around Phoenix, Arizona, for example, that's out on the edge of town. But then we can also have them that are hybrid, which are partly in town and then maybe take you out to the countryside. Or we could have what I call wedges to the edges, where we have a grand loop around the edge of a city, and then we can follow the greenways and trails that, you know, sometimes the rail lines, for example, come into the cores of cities, where you could take those out to the edge and get out to the grand loop. And then in one of the presentations I did, somebody suggested, well, let's attach smaller loops that people could take along these grand loops, so we can even form daisy chains. There's almost infinite ways you could create a grand loop. But these grand loops can be an alternative to harder to get to outdoor destinations like state parks or national forests. particularly with people limited means who may not have the money to buy the gas to get out there or even have a car to get out there, but also for all people who don't want to sit in traffic just trying to get to the outdoors. And so, what if we could provide closer in places? And I think it also could be a way we could facilitate more lightweight travel, that you can travel with a day pack instead of a backpack. And you're not carrying 50 pounds on your back, but maybe a water bottle and some basics. Because on a Grand Loop, because they go around the edges of cities, many times there's towns and hamlets and places you can stop to get a meal or get some provisions, or even spend the night if you wanted to take a multi-day trek. So I think the Grand Loops become kind of a wraparound recreational facility that gives you kind of an experience of nature and maybe more rural experience, but you don't have to go quite as far. And we can even begin to link together parks and preserves on the edges of cities to create daisy chains, kind of a green charm bracelet. And when I started thinking about this, I kind of thought, oh, this maybe is just crazy. Who's ever going to do this? But when I started to research it, I noticed a whole lot of cities were doing these things. I mentioned Phoenix and the Maricopa Trail. Las Vegas has one about 3/4 built right now. Louisville, Kentucky. There's one in Rio de Janeiro that takes you from the core city out into the rainforests. Paris is building one. I'll talk about that in a minute. And there's even a history in Portland where the Olmsteds developed the 40-mile loop more than 100 years ago. And that's now been expanded into a loop system in Portland, Oregon, and Denver. So there's places that are looking at these kinds of ideas. And, begin to think of this as one colleague put it, wrapping the Appalachian Trail around the city. That's the kind of the vision of a Grand Loop. Or, maybe it becomes like a national park that's a wraparound that's easier for people to get to and less crowded. The other element are town walks. And these are closer in places where people can get their daily exercise. I really believe you need to get out there every day and walk, just like brushing your teeth. And these configurations could be destinations. Maybe it's around a historic part of town, or a community walk like a community park where it's a 5-minute walk away, but they're branded really pleasant walks, and ultimately walks that are outside your door, because that's the most important goal, is to have universal walkability. And these could configure in many ways. Maybe it's a 3-kilometer walking route that might be a community destination. They could maybe be attached to greenways to go off a greenway and experience the community, or even attached to transit lines where you could take the transit or the bus or the train to a stop and do a loop, or maybe go from one stop to another. And there's high-end ones that are now being built. I discovered people are doing these too. Here's one in Salt Lake City called the Green Loop that's being built there. And you guys can Google all this and learn more about it. The 5280 trail in Denver is a 5-mile long Grand Loop around the civic core of Denver, the Capitol, and Coors Field, where the Colorado Rockies play, and those kinds of destinations. Here's one I particularly like. This is the Turquoise Trail, which exists in Tucson. And this was actually built by 2 ladies with the Historic Society who found some paint that the city had. And they got the city street painters, the white line people, to put a turquoise line on a series of sidewalks through the historic part of Old Tucson. And it's about a 3-mile walk. And you just follow the turquoise line through the old barrios, past some of the colonial buildings. There's places to stop and eat. It's not only a tourist destination, but a destination for Tucson residents to really experience classic Old Tucson. And what if we could weave these Grand Loops and town walks into integrated networks? And if we're going to get people to engage, we want to talk about the joy and benefits of walkability. And I won't go all through these individually, but longer life, they're finding now that it may stave off dementia. there's just so many things. The one I like is that you kind of, it enhances creativity just to go out for a walk every day. But again, as we talked about, Thoreau was saying, just connecting people to the outdoors and getting that joy of the journey, getting that sense of self-confidence that you've done it, and importantly, preserving for people the right to roam. We're losing that very quickly. Particularly with some of the political attitudes right now about not having public spaces and privatization of everything. Increasingly, we're seeing no trespassing signs and people describing walking places and biking places as woke, whatever that means. So we're seeing the loss of an ethos that was once there in our heritage of having places where people could get on the landscape. And importantly, just having those free spaces where you don't have to go to a formal park or a formal space, and a kid can just poke around and catch a crawfish or build a treehouse or something. We're losing those spaces. Again, I want to come back to the notion of diverse, equitable access, particularly being able to access places free of fear. Regardless of your ethnicity, your gender, or your ability. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to go a little bit quickly. Let me know when I'm out of time, by the way, Chuck, so I don't go too long here. Here's some just quick strategies about creating successful and affordable infrastructure that can do this. Because footpaths are easier to build and maintain than multi-purpose paved formal bike paths, I think we can more readily adapt them to existing infrastructure and bring them to people's doorsteps. And we also can begin to think of roadways as more than just automobile conveyances. We can maybe adapt to the existing road rights of way more. For example, complete streets rather than just for cars, really envisioning all of our urban thoroughfares ultimately as complete streets where there's always a walk where people can walk side by side. Ideally, it's 5 feet wide with at least 6 to 8 foot wide tree median separating people from street traffic. And a number of cities and communities have already adapted this into their standards. So this could be at the core of this becoming, these complete streets can become part of an overlay park system where it exists right out your door. They can go through commercial districts and they can be places for socializing and those kinds of benefits. And, key elements are making sure people can get across those streets along the way. Part of this too, that I discovered when I started going out and walking around my community is the notion of walkable streets. We can also adapt streets themselves, local residential streets that have low volumes, traffic volumes, into places where pedestrians are accommodated. It's sort of the pedestrian equivalent of a bike lane. And obviously we have to make sure the traffic volumes are low and the signage is there. But I saw people out there doing it, and it can be a pleasant experience. That's a key part of it. Even on a Grand Loop, we can incorporate, it doesn't all have to be a built paved trail around the city. It can use country lanes and roads, which I discovered when I walked around the periphery of Denver, that we walked on some of these back roads. And I did that. I also walked around the city of Buffalo, did the same thing, 120 miles, did that a couple of years ago. It can be done where you use the roads as well as the trails as part of your route. And people are already creating these routes. We also have the notion of incorporating Wooners and ciclovia and quiet streets into this. You probably all know a ciclovia is the temporary use of a street for biking and walking, maybe on a weekend, but incorporating those in. We want to get people more motivated to engage. The motivating factors I think we want to consider is having a meaningful walk, addressing the urge that people have to explore, a sense of mission. Maybe the destination is just to get to the grocery store or see a neighbor or go to the library. Pursuit of fitness is important, of course, and social engagement. But the most important thing that all the studies are finding, it's basically finding pleasure. that's what motivates people. You can tell people over and over again, you got to slim down, you got to improve your health. But if you find pleasure in doing it every day, that's what actually motivates people to engage. And that means overcoming barriers, getting people to feel like they have the confidence they can do it, and people feeling welcome. And I'll talk about more of that in the discussion that comes later. But giving people the sense of confidence that they can do it. And again, that notion of feeling safe. And so also providing destinations and waypoints, providing an incredible experience for people. We're really all in the entertainment business when we build facilities like this. And we want to think about the joy of the journey. And I like to think in terms of the 7 senses, not only the 5 we traditionally think of, but also the mental and spiritual aspects of getting out and being on a trail. And also when we build these kinds of facilities, thinking about what's close in, the sounds, the sights, the smells. We can use landscaping along a tree to buffer, and also the long views. And I'll get into that more in the discussion as we go. Providing creature comforts along the way, that's essential, particularly places to rest, and things like restrooms, especially with older populations, places to duck out when there's a storm. And that helps us overcome the notion of one of your Maryland residents, Manny Mwamba, who talks about that notion. Places to have those soft pauses for gentle moments of rest. We want to provide that. Wayfinding is a key element. Art and culture can be a part of this picture. And so to do this, I think we want to leverage things by making critical connections to start, having regulations and things that, including connections between cul-de-sacs and newer suburban communities. And this is the way that we can begin to not only improve experiences for people, but also create a better sense of our environment. We can think of these trails ultimately as the armatures of green belts that bring along with them vegetation and habitat, even if it's small little patches that we can add to it, because those become features. They also become ways to absorb water in floods, and we can begin to attach these kinds of green nodes to our trails. So we can think of trails as armatures of more greenery. And there's places where folks are doing that now. Even highways can become more integrated when we plan our roads as armatures of more natural landscapes. So we think of these corridors as pulling along with them these other kinds of benefits. And I'm going to wrap up, and you'll hear about more of this, I think, in the other presentations. Don't forget, we have to maintain these things. Going forward, we need to think about the notion of crowding and conflicts and finding the resources. And particularly, we're going to have the notion of heat. I think that's going to be an increasing concern, and providing places where people can get refuge from heat and shading corridors. And that's also being done in a number of communities. And we need to just begin to think, working with other disciplines, working together, engineers talking to landscape architects, talking to planners, talking to artists, to make these things happen, and building viral keystone projects that can inspire. So anyway, that is, I'll go back to unsharing the screen and hand it back to you, Chuck, and I'll get into some of these things in a little more detail in the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, and great information. And again, I encourage everyone to continue to ask questions, put them in the question Q&A box so that we can answer those questions as many as possible during our Q&A session at the end. Again, thank you very much, Bob. Now we'll hear from Meg Young, Deputy Director of MDOT's Active Transportation and Mobility. Meg Young is an urban planner with 10 years of experience working to make it safer for people to share the road. Her portfolio at MDOT includes policy for making people walking and biking, the Bikes Grants Program, the Walk Maryland program, innovating the safe routes to schools in Maryland, developing a micro-mobility program, and managing the development of Maryland Transportation's statewide transportation trails strategic plan. Prior to being at MDOT, she worked at the Federal Transit Administration and at Baltimore City Department of Transportation. Meg completed her Master's of Urban Planning at the University of New Orleans and is a certified bicycle instructor through the American League of Cyclists. She resides in Baltimore and leads a multi-modal life filled with hiking, biking, scooting, swimming, and the MARC train. So welcome, Meg.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Chuck, and Bob for laying the groundwork here about the real importance of greenways and trails. So I apologize, everyone. I'm getting over a case of strep throat, so I might at times have to take a break. But I'm very excited to be here with you all today to share about how MDOT is approaching planning for transportation trails and putting a lot of what Bob mentioned actually into practice here in Maryland. So I'll cover a few things. First of all, what is a transportation trail from our point of view as a Department of Transportation, and then dive into our recently published statewide transportation trails strategic plan. There's two parts of that plan that I really want to highlight for everyone here today. First of all, that's how to build support for transportation trails in your community. And then something we're really looking forward to in the future, which is developing a Maryland Destination Trails designation to really speak to that last part Bob mentioned about operations, maintenance, and keeping our trails in good, safe condition once they're built. So, what is a transportation trail? And what role does the Maryland Department of Transportation play here? A transportation trail, in short, is often referred to as a shared use path or a side path. They connect to our transportation network, so you would be able to get to them conceivably from your front door or from a transit stop. To meet our definition, they should be ADA compliant. We do have some crushed gravel transportation trails in Maryland as well. And they're open to the public for bicycle and pedestrian use, for walking, for biking, or using with micromobility. What we're not including in this definition are mountain biking trails or hiking trails, or loop trails that are fully within a park where park has to be open for you to access them. So we are really looking at trails that are open 24 hours that you can use to get where you need to go. And one reason this has become a focus for the Maryland Department of Transportation is that last year we updated our complete streets policy. And moving forward, any projects within the MDOT right-of-way will require a look at including multimodal facilities unless a waiver is granted. So that means that if we are doing something like striping, repaving, we need to look at local plans to see if they call for a bike facility, improved sidewalks, or potentially a shared use path. And shared use paths are included in our context-driven guide, which details how we should be building roadways to meet the context and the needs of the community that they serve. Shared use paths are called out as a treatment throughout the guide, but specifically in suburban and rural settings, there's statistics that show a shared use path can reduce bike crashes by 37%, and they can also provide a really space-efficient solution to allow space for people both walking and biking in a community. So the Complete Streets policy was a major reason why we decided to update our transportation trails plan. Our transportation trails plan was first published in 2009, and then in 2024, when we signed our updated Complete Streets policy into effect and published our 2050 bicycle master plan, they really called for an update to our transportation trails plan and how we're building transportation trails in the state of Maryland. So based on these two plans, based on the plan and the policy, we embarked on this endeavor last year to inventory our existing shared use paths and transportation trails, identify where communities want more paths and trails across Maryland, and identify tools to make projects be implemented more seamlessly. Over the course of developing the Transportation Trails Strategic Plan, we came up with the vision and goals that you see on the screen. Our vision is a safe and accessible transportation trail network that connects Marylanders to opportunities across their communities, towns, and the state. And underlying that are 5 goals. We want to empower local communities. We want to, of course, emphasize safety and reduce pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities and injuries. We want to connect visitors and residents to Maryland's opportunities. We want a high quality network that connects Maryland's regions. And we want to coordinate state agencies and resources, because in addition to the Department of Transportation, we do work with our Department of Natural Resources, our Department of Planning, and it is a statewide effort to improve our transportation trails network. To develop our plan, we worked with a technical advisory committee that had representatives from across the state. We reached out to every county in the state of Maryland to form this, and again, we worked with some of our partners across the state, the Department of Natural Resources, and our state highway administration. Over the course of the year, here's an overview of the process we underwent to develop our Transportation Trails Strategic Plan. We started with first looking at our existing conditions and building out a transportation trails database that showed existing trails, planned, and potential trails. We then started engagement with the public and with our local stakeholders with a transportation trails survey, interviews and conversations with our local partners to develop our toolkits. And the end result was our Transportation Trails Strategic Plan, which I'll share a link to, as well as an interactive website where you can explore all of the tools and we'll be able to track our progress on our transportation trails network. So I'll take you through some of these steps, and then I want to really focus on one of our toolkits and our plans for destination trails. So our first step of existing conditions, what we found is that transportation trails are referenced in so many state plans. These include plans not only from the Maryland Department of Transportation, but the Moore-Miller State Plan and plans from the Department of Natural Resources and the Maryland Department of Environment. We also are doing pretty well with transportation trails in Maryland. We have 1,359 existing miles of transportation trails that provide 34% of Marylanders access to a trail within a half a mile of their house. Now, if we were to build out all of the trails that are currently in local plans, those numbers would go up to 1,725 miles of trails and would give 42% of Marylanders access to trails. Once we get up to proposed, over half of Marylanders, 54%, would have access to a transportation trail within a half a mile of their home. You can explore our transportation trails database on our interactive map. I'll share a link to this in the chat. But this was the database that we developed by, again, looking at our existing trails, going through plans from every county across Maryland, and speaking with advocates across the state to gauge other potential trails that already have some groundswell and some support across our state. So this is really useful to understand what projects are underway in your area. And I've already found myself using this map whenever I'm going to a different part of the state and seeing what the plans are. Somebody mentioned a couple of different neighborhoods that have different trails connecting and subdivisions. I think they're in other states, but I would really call out Columbia in Maryland as a place where a lot of subdivisions have a transportation trail right outside their house. But you can explore all of these and customize your view on our interactive website. Once we had finished our existing conditions, we had a transportation trails survey that was open for the general public, where we were looking to gauge trail usage, implementation, and demographics of trail users. From this, we found a number of things that 86% of respondents are trail users and 13% were non-users. But of these, even with users and non-users, they supported building more trails. Our state priorities that came out of this transportation trails survey was that they prioritize building more trails statewide, although non-users prefer prioritizing areas without existing trails, indicating they're probably non-users because they don't have a trail within a half a mile of their house. Then we got into breaking down the trail project lifecycle analysis. So what goes into building a good trail? It starts with building support. Again, that groundswell, knowing what's planned in your community. Then you move into the phase of funding, land acquisition, then planning and implementation, the actual engineering and construction of a plan. And then even once a trail is built, operations and maintenance continue. When we broke out this project life cycle, there are three which you'll notice have ongoing arrows because they never end. Building support, funding, operations, and maintenance are ongoing from when a trail is conceived and all the way into existence. So these three parts of a project life cycle are what we chose to be our toolkits, which is what I think really makes our transportation trails plan special and brings the strategic part of the plan to life. These toolkits pull together all of our policies, case studies, and tools for implementing trails. Within the plan, we break down different roles for building trails by the life cycle, from building support to funding and acquisition. You can explore in the plan the role of MDOT, the Maryland Department of Transportation, as well as local roles. But what I want to focus on today, a little bit more in depth, is our toolkits for transportation trails that bring to life how a person can be involved in a transportation trails project. In particular, building support for trails. So if you are looking to build more trails in your community, what can you do? This toolkit identifies planning steps, outlines potential allies, and includes case studies about how to move a transportation trail project forward. So an overview of building support for a transportation trail, first of all, is identifying the need for your community. Then we really encourage you to participate in local planning efforts. Build your coalition and make sure you've engaged local nonprofits, advisory groups, officials, and agencies. So what does this look like in practice? To identify a need in our plan, MDOT recommends a number of criteria for trail selection. So which trails should make their way into a local plan? For us, that includes improving safety, and we have our vulnerable roadway user assessment of where our safety needs are the greatest. It includes access to opportunity, access to parks, access to transit, gap filling projects, and activity centers or destination connections. Once you've selected a potential trail project, we really encourage you to participate in local planning. This is where it all starts, because at the state, we cannot tell you what the local priorities are to a T. So this can take a couple of different forms or shapes. There are things like bicycle and pedestrian advisory committees. In Talbot County, they recently launched their bicycle and pedestrian advisory committee that covers topics like transportation trails on a quarterly basis. It could look like weighing in on your comprehensive plan. The town of Northeast recently embarked on this and included trails, sidewalks, and bicycle facilities as a key part of their transportation network goals. It might look like a transportation plan. Currently, Prince George's County has their Go Prince George's Countywide Transportation Plan up for public comment. So we encourage all Prince George's County residents to comment on that plan before the end of the year. It might look like a bicycle and pedestrian plan. Right now, Frederick is planning their bicycle and pedestrian plan and including updating their trail network specific to biking, walking, and trails. There's also feasibility studies. Right now, Garrett County has just finished their County Pathways and Connections initiatives. And it can even be as specific as weighing in on a specific project. Baltimore City is currently collecting feedback on their Safe Routes to Schools projects, and they have web pages for every specific transportation project in the city. So engaging in efforts like these eventually does flow up to the state level, and it's what we look at to see what projects have local support and we can partner with at the state level to provide guidance, technical assistance, or connect to funding. So if you explore the Building Support Toolkit, you can find a checklist of different plans that you would want your trail project to be in. Again, could be a bike head master plan. It could be a land preservation parks and recreation plan. But if you explore online, there's a number of different planning processes that trails can be a part of. Now, the other part of the Building Support Toolkit is about building your coalition. We link to several on the webpage, and I'll highlight two of them, the Maryland Eastern Shore Trail Network and the Baltimore Greenway Trail Coalition. The Maryland Eastern Shore Trail Network is doing a great job of connecting 9 different counties on trail projects. They cover all sorts of topics for how trails are important for health and wellness, environmental benefits, economic impact, and community connectivity. On a more project-specific level, the Baltimore Greenway Trails Network provides all of the talking points and brings together groups to talk about social equity, health and wellness, protecting the environment, creating connections, providing access to businesses and the economy, and again, has a wide coalition of partners to speak to all of those different topics. So when you're building your coalition, we provide on our Trails plan a list of groups and organizations that you might want to involve, again, ranging from public health to housing and community development. Rails to Trails Conservancy has a great toolkit on this as well, and provides guidance on, once you have your coalition, how you can structure it to involve everyone and everything from public engagement to governance and seeking funding for your project. You can explore case studies on our interactive websites and see how coalitions have led to great trail projects in Maryland, from the Easton Rail Trail, the Capitol Crescent Trail, and the Carroll Creek Linear Park. Now, once the trail is in place, the other thing I wanted to touch on briefly is Maryland destination trails. Our tourism and commerce tell you we have a trail system second in Maryland. Our nearly 1,400 miles of trails are often destinations in and of themselves. Right now, MDOT is working with the Maryland Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee to develop a trail subcommittee and designate Maryland destination trails. We've proposed a number of destination trails already that meet the criteria of being destinations in and of themselves, at least 10 miles long, providing recreation and health benefits, and you can build a whole day out of visiting these trails. Now, our proposed criteria for these trails include cross-state and interstate trails, scenic access trails, trails of at least 10 miles, and branded trails. Destination trail has to follow a couple different best practices. That includes top-notch safety and maintenance, signage and placemaking, and then branding, maps, and promotion. And we're hoping that by developing this designation, we can encourage more trails in Maryland to follow these best practices. So what does this look like in practice? For safety and maintenance, designated trails should have a maintenance plan and plan to fund maintenance from the moment they are built. They should periodically consider any needed safety upgrades to reflect new design guidelines or their current usage. So we do have a number of funding sources for maintenance that are highlighted here. The Transportation Alternatives Program has funded now 7 phases of rehabilitation and repairs to the C&O Canal. Our Recreational Trails Program has funded a trail crew in the Patapsco Valley State Park. And then our Bikeways Network program has funded upgrades such as the project currently underway in the town of Mount Rainier that's looking to have safety upgrades for their levee trail. And pictured here is of the recently released AASHTO guide for the development of bicycle facilities that says if you have more peak hour volumes, that you should have wider widths. So the previous 10-foot minimum for transportation trails actually should be wider if you have more visitors. So things like these are really important for transportation trails to track their usage and if they're meeting the needs of their users. The next thing that destination trails should have as a best practice is signage and placemaking. These allow users to track their progress, and they can share information and allow places to stop. So some of our proposed destination trails include the Torrey C. Brown Rail Trail, which has great signage about trail rules and sharing the trail. Our BWI Hiker Biker Trail has several places to stop and have fun along the trail. And then the Baltimore and Annapolis Trail not only has great signage, but somebody spoke to how to bring in economic usage. The Baltimore and Annapolis Trail has several places along the trail where businesses have opened their back doors, whereas the front door is accessible from the parking lot. The back door to several coffee shops, sandwich shops are all accessible from the trail, and they provide seating out back for trail users. And then last but not least, destination trails should have dedicated marketing themes and have maps available through organizations such as the Maryland Heritage Areas or our Office of Tourism. So what is the impact of destination trails and why are we seeking this designation? Quite frankly, destination trails bring a lot of people and have a huge impact on local economies. The Great Allegheny Passage reports an annual economic impact of over $800,000 per mile. They create jobs as well as spending in the local economy. Similarly, we have this data for the C&O Canal towpath, which tracks not only how many visitors come each year, but where they're spending their money. Whether it's in hotels, local restaurants, retail, or transportation to get there. The C&O Canal has an estimated 1.3 annual 1.3 million annual visitors. So really quickly, again, our proposed destination trails, our next speaker is going to speak to rail trails. And what you'll notice here is there are a number of rail trails that we have as proposed destination trails, from the Indian Head Rail Trail to the Torrey C. Brown and the Western Maryland Rail Trail. And one current project MDOT is working on is our Frederick Douglass Rail Trail project that we hope will be a future destination trail. I'm out of time, but I will share these links in the chat for our trails plan and our interactive website. If you want to be involved in transportation trails in Maryland, I encourage you to email mbpac@mdot.maryland.gov, where we will have our trails subcommittee. Thank you all, and I'll look forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Meg. Really enjoy that. And again, please give us your questions and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. Now we're going to hear from Tom McKay. Tom began his railroad career by volunteering at the Heritage Railroads and the Heritage Rail Equipment Operators. After graduating from Frostburg State University, Tom worked for CSX as a train crew freight conductor. He was able to attend CSX management training program, but ultimately moved to Baltimore City, where he worked as the manager of the Bombardier Transportation, which operates the Camden and Brunswick MARC passenger service in the MARC Operations Center. In 2018, Tom moved to a state role with MTA and worked for MARC Train as the training and regulatory compliance manager, training EMS first responders on techniques to safely respond to railroad emergencies, where he created and is implementing the first MARC system safety program plan. Tom also enjoys cycling and used to compete nationally in various disciplines. Today, Tom enjoys long rides with friends exploring his home on the Delmarva Peninsula. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I'm going to try to share my screen, and I'll build on my introduction there a little bit. I've been with Maryland Department of Transportation at the Office of the Secretary for 3 years in my current role as the Rail Program and Policy Manager. And today I'm coming to you as sort of an ambassador of our program, which handles a lot of the interactions with our state's freight rail operators. The state of Maryland actually owns a considerable amount of freight rail lines, which I'll describe here in a moment. And we also, we try to support the MDOT Office of Active Transportation and Micromobility in their efforts that Meg was just describing with the Transportation Trails initiative that they have been leading for several years now. So as Bob sort of started us off at a very high level, and then Meg sort of brought us down to transportation trails, I'm going to go down to a subset of those, which I think many of us are going to be familiar with, which are rail trails. And I will try to give a brief update and overview of the work that we do here. And hopefully I can advance the screen. There we go. So, we're gonna. I want to sort of begin at the starting point here for many of our rail infrastructure corridors here in the state of Maryland. And like many other places, our rail lines date back to the 19th century. And during that time, private companies, railroads were chartered to acquire land and build rail lines between our communities. These would stretch for long distances, right? They would, in many cases, connect very distant centers of population, sometimes even connecting states together. And they, over the course of time, led to the development of many of our communities that sprang up at the stations and local places along the way. So for over 100 years, the rail lines and the train stations and the depots really contributed to the feeling of place in many of our towns and communities. We've recentered the way we build our cities and towns on other modes of transportation, by and large, highways, roads, etc. But those places, those sort of centers of population still, by and large, kind of still exist around the old train station areas and the old rail infrastructure itself. So a lot of that still remains. Our rail lines are highly engineered. They're pretty flat. They're pretty straight typically, right? Railroad can't do what a regular highway does. And so these corridors are fairly preferential as far as connecting places. And those criteria lend themselves to active transportation quite easily, because if you can choose between, climbing over a great big hill to get to where you have to go, either by foot or by bike, you'd probably prefer to take a flat course that might go around it to get to where you need to be. At the same time, these pieces of infrastructure connected our communities. They can also form barriers between neighborhoods at the local level. Very often we see, especially with very busy or very heavily used rail lines, commuter lines, and freight lines, these corridors can actually act as barriers in some cases. So that is something that we try to be very sensitive to and identify where those issues are developing. But at the same time, where we have very light density or perhaps maybe inactive, those lines and those areas can actually be very helpful to reconnect communities that might have otherwise been divided. And by and large, through the history of our rail corridors, the ownership has always been by private companies, right? So these railroads were built and they sort of combined and split apart over time, forming the rail corporations that we have today. In the 1980s, the state of Maryland had the opportunity to acquire over 200 miles of rail corridors that were otherwise going to be liquidated. And that's where our program traces its origins back to, when the state of Maryland acquired those lines with the specific intent of preserving rail operations where it could happen, but where it couldn't happen, using those rail corridors for other publicly beneficial purposes. So a little bit about rail lines and how they operate. A freight railroad, specifically in the United States, is authorized to operate by the United States Surface Transportation Board at the federal level. If you're keeping up with national events, the Surface Transportation Board, like many other federal agencies right now, is closed for business until the government reopens. But they actually issue the certificates and exemptions that are necessary for a freight railroad to operate as a common carrier. And the reason that is vested with the federal government is because this service is an interstate commerce service, and that function is in the Constitution, vested with the federal government. So it's a little bit different than a lot of the trucking or intrastate freight operations that happen locally. Railroads, because of their natural national network, right, they're handled mostly at the federal level for these kinds of things. Shippers are a key component to the way railroads work. You got to have shippers generating freight, and they cannot be turned away from a common carrier. So if you have a shipment of something to go by freight car, that railroad has to pick it up. They're required to take it. And that's sort of the trade-off and the public good benefit of having freight rail lines. Many of these services that continue to serve our communities are critical for the economic developments of these areas. They support many, many thousands of jobs through those shippers. And a lot of places where that service is available, we see continued positive economic development, which could not be replicated otherwise. Unfortunately, though, we do get times where our rail corridors are no longer commercially viable. And you may have heard the term abandonment. The way we use the term abandonment, means specifically the Surface Transportation Board has authorized the abandonment of that service on that freight line. So a lot of times railroad tracks might look abandoned because they have trees growing out of them or weeds or et cetera. But oftentimes those tracks may not actually be abandoned. They may still technically be subject to rail operations if required by a shipper or otherwise. However, there are times still more often, right, where those lines are truly abandoned. When that happens, we've seen rail lines get dissolved, right? They get chopped up. Corridors that were assembled sometimes in fee simple ownership, sometimes through easement. Sometimes they can reverse back or revert back to adjacent landowners. Sometimes they're sold off to adjacent landowners again. And once those corridors are lost, there is really not an easy way to get them back again. So, especially in our modern day of age, it's extremely time consuming and difficult to try to assemble new corridors. So, our goal and our mission is to preserve the corridors that we have in our portfolio and use them to the best of our ability, whether that's freight rail or alternate, what we call interim uses. I'm going to talk about that next. So, in those cases where freight rail service is no longer viable or needed, we do have the opportunity to use them for what's called interim use. And interim use is a term that's defined in national law under the National Trails Act, which allows us to rail bank certain areas of our rail corridors. This is super important and it's super helpful when it comes to preserving our rail assets, because it lets us push the pause button on that abandonment process, and it lets us preserve what we have for future use. It can be used in the future for rail. It can be used in the future or in the present even for trails, utilities, and sometimes even transit purposes. But it's sort of, the idea sort of revolves around the conservation of these assets in that way. Ownership during a rail banking situation can sometimes change, and sometimes it doesn't have to change. It really depends on the circumstances. However, for a rail line to be rail banked, there always has to be a trail sponsor that signs on to take on the sort of managerial and financial responsibilities that go along with the rail property itself. That shift of responsibility from the former railroad to the interim use trail sponsor is the sort of pivotal function of a rail banking arrangement, right? That's handing it off to the next user for the public benefit. And what this results in ultimately is changing a lot of these sort of derelict or maybe overgrown, unused rail assets, and they convert them into a public benefit that really helps the communities that they're in, and oftentimes even connect communities together. All right. Now, do all rail trails have to be rail banked? No, they do not. A lot of times railroad lines were disposed of before the National Trails Act was existed. So we have a lot of rail trails in our state that were built and developed without this tool that we have today. And in those cases, they're not subject to the return of rail service like our rail bank lines are. And so you will see, this is an example in this photograph of the B&A trail. And if you're familiar with the B&A trail in Anne Arundel County, you get about halfway down the trail and you're following the rail alignment fairly well. You get to Marley Station Mall, and all of a sudden you have to do this great big jug handle to get around Marley Station Mall. That's a clue that the B&A trail is not actually rail banked, right? So that is not subject to the return of rail service. But that doesn't prohibit local places from building trails in just the normal way. That whether a trail is rail banked or not is sort of really site specific and a result of the history of the property and the surrounding development in that location. But frequently you can't tell the difference just by looking or riding or walking along. Now, I was sort of struck by one of the slides in Bob's presentation earlier, where a gentleman was holding a sign that said "Recycle the railroads," and I thought that was a really cool image, because rail banking is a tool for that exact purpose, right? We have a photo here of Cumberland that some of you may be familiar with, and I don't have, I wanted to try to find a before picture of what this area looked like, but this is a space that's been recycled from what was a former railroad yard that was not particularly productive for anybody into a community space that is sort of the focal point of this area of the city. And, you know, this connects pretty quickly into this idea of third spaces. And hopefully I can bring this back a little bit to where I began, which is our rail corridors were sort of built to connect the nodes of our communities, and those sort of that fabric, that community fabric often already exists around rail infrastructure. And so recycling those railroads and reusing that oftentimes presents a unique opportunity to tap into that infrastructure and that fabric that already exists. So you know, once again, these are very site specific opportunities that we have, and they're related to the development of those areas. But these you know, this idea of the third space and bringing people into a place that they can recreate or socialize, or even from the transportation perspective, like move around and get connected to where they need to be is pretty critical. I'm going to share two little examples from some of the properties that we manage. Here's a picture of Ridgely, Maryland in Caroline County, where the town converted a section of rail line to what's called the Ridgely Railroad Park. And in the bottom right corner there, there's a photo of one of the several town festivals that they host at this location every year. And because that train station is like, it's already right in the center of town, right? It's their natural focal point. It's their natural square, you know, for this town. And so, you know, this was the Mac and Cheese, I think, festival from a couple of years ago, which was a huge success. And it would not have been possible if we weren't able to recycle that property and use it beneficially. Here's another example that Meg mentioned earlier, Easton Rails to Trails. This is probably our oldest and most successful example from one of the properties that we manage. We partner with the town of Easton, who build and maintains this asset. And it's a critical part of their fabric. And they've actually built it out, connecting it with trails that stretch all over town, right? East and west, and other pieces of infrastructure that we're not directly involved in. And so they have a transportation network there that's developing that's really top notch. And much like in Ridgely, you know, this is also the focal point, the natural focal point of many of the neighborhoods. And this is a photograph of the Hispanic Culture Festival that happens every spring. And you know, this area is just a great spot for people to gather and hold community events. So that's a very high level overview of the kind of work that we do to support the Office of Active Transportation and Micromobility. Our office has a website, mdot.maryland.gov/freight-rail. That will take you to a page with all kinds of links and resources on there that you can read through. One of the things that I like to promote when I get the chance is our public projects manual, which I have this is the cover of here. We have this on our website, and it sort of really does a deep dive into the purpose of our program and how it got started and how we manage the oftentimes competing uses that we see from our communities and from our railroads. At the end of the day, we seek to strike a balance between the benefits of rail operations and also the benefits of interim use. And in some places, we've even managed to have them exist concurrently, although that is still a work in progress in a lot of spots. And I really do want to, you know, emphasize that you know, rail service is an important part of our climate future, right? Because it is a very efficient means of moving freight. And so we value that asset for what it is. And we also look forward to maximizing the benefit of the remaining parts of our rail portfolio as well for trails or whatever else can be used for the community. I will end there and give it back for questions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Tom. We really appreciate that. And we have been collecting several questions, but please feel free to continue and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as possible. Throughout the webinar, we gather those. And at this point, we're going to ask each of our panelists to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves. And I will go through a few of these. And we'll try to do as many as possible before 12 noon. So the first question, I think maybe a little bit more towards Bob, but the others could chime in. How can you facilitate connections between walking paths and businesses so that people can easily stop to eat, spend time, support the local community while facilitating outdoor recreation?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think that's one of the keys to successful corridors. And in planning and laying them out, one of the tools I've used actually when I've gone out and walked these routes, by the way, is Google Maps. And I've actually gone and like put in, for example, coffee shops. And I've also put in grocery stores because when I'm planning my walks, I want to know where I can stop, and maybe get something to eat. I've put different kinds of things, restaurants. So in planning it, maybe start there if you're thinking of putting a route together, a branded walk or a grand loop, and then kind of make those accessible, incorporate that into your planning, those kinds of destinations. The other speakers talked about this too, having these places along the way to stop, make those businesses part of the places that, in fact, that's part of the highlight of these kinds of walks. And then if you're a planner, maybe going out and talking to a few of these folks or doing a walk yourself. I always believe in kicking the dirt and communicating, let them know what you're thinking, maybe build a constituency of support.
Great, thanks.
Well, if you don't mind, Chuck, just to
sure.
say, this is one of the reasons why MDOT wants to work with our other state agencies. Our Department of Commerce and Tourism has destination marketing officers in every county in Maryland. And so including trails and local businesses on the same publications, so people realize how close they are to each other, and having that wayfinding and branding. So, if you're at the coffee shop, the trail's right there. So there's a lot of different tactics, but that's why it requires not only the transportation lens, but involving that Chamber of Commerce or involving, the destination marketing officers and tourism near the trail.
Great, thanks. I'm going to continue to move on so we can get as many of these as possible. People feel safe and comfortable when we're walking, whether or not in a neighborhood or alongside, seems to be critical to the whole process. What methods can nonprofits and local governments use to create the safe and comfortable experience when walking? Also got a similar question that raised a question about how can we best apply CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design in transportation trails? I don't know if Meg, you want to start that one, or maybe Bob.
Go ahead, Meg. Yeah.
Sure. So I think that comes a lot into design, as somebody said, CPTED. But there are different opportunities for maintenance and programming aside from just the construction funds that get something built. There can often be like our DHCD has different funds available for sustainable communities to do some connections, to do whether it's pedestrian scale lighting or to make sure there's more eyes on a trail. So I don't have a concise answer, actually. Robert?
Yeah, I think, this is a key to getting people out and walking and feeling enabled. And there's many aspects to safety. Obviously, there's crime and security. There's also the notion that, particularly with elderly people, but anybody, if you have some kind of problem, finding help, and then weather, heat. So I think you want to be thinking about all these things and laying out a path as some of the design criteria. I like to call it being streetwise too. I think as Meg mentioned, are there people on the street, other people around? Can you avoid isolated spots on planning your walk? So part of it is just laying it out to have more eyes, on you. And then the traffic safety thing is kind of assessing if you're going to be walking along a street or in a street, doing those traffic checks. So I guess the way I'd simply put it is safety with those criteria is essential, and that's got to be your checklist. And again, I'll repeat: go out and walk the routes yourself if you're laying them out. That's the best way to figure things out in terms of what might be going on. And then there's a whole other category, and I won't take up too much time on that, but just the notion of people of different genders and ethnicity feeling safe. And I think in your planning, I think, when you lay out a route, consult with other genders and other people in other ethnic groups, get their perspective, because it may be very different than the perspective you have.
Well, thanks so much on that one. I have this one that I was kind of curious about from Tom, to give him a chance to pipe into it. But I was curious about the issue about are the trails likely to once they're built, how likely is the rail service to come back, and do they, you talked about the rail banking, but what options are there for local governments to explore this issue of rail banking?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so rail banking sort of pivots on the idea that the property is subject to the return of rail service. So it has to be possible that the rail line could be rebuilt in the future, but it doesn't have to be probable, right? It doesn't have to be, it has to be, like I said, possible, but doesn't mean it has to be likely or even imminent or even planned, right? So that allows that rail corridor to remain in its current shape. We can remove the tracks and we can rebuild with active transportation infrastructure. We can put utilities in for various reasons. We can do transit even in some cases. So yeah, and it's not real likely. I mean, so far we've not seen actual rail trail revert back to a railroad in the state of Maryland, but I don't think that that's impossible to happen. The key would be that we just haven't waited long enough, right? If there's an economic need for that railroad, it's technically possible that could come back. Oftentimes, if that were the case, the trail, having been there for a number of years, would in all likelihood be re-engineered to accommodate both uses together. And that's something we see more and more. And we've even seen sort of, even in rail banked areas, we're seeing trails being built concurrently. That way the railroad infrastructure, or at least space for the rail infrastructure, is preserved. So all of those things are options in the future there. What was the second part?
No, I think you covered it in that part. So so thank you, Tom. We are at the 12 o'clock time, so we're going to share all these questions. I've got more questions that obviously we can answer at this point. We're going to share these with our panelists and to see if we can either incorporate them into follow-up information about the Walkinar series, or reach out to individuals along the way. So again, I want to thank all of our panelists. This concludes our third Walkinar for the October 2025 series. We'd like to offer a deep gratitude to Bob, Meg, and Tom for their presentations and engaging discussion. Thank you again for everyone who attended today, and to Jessica at MDP, who was our communications wizard and make sure everything is run as smoothly as possible. A complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. When you exit today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take the time for a few moments to provide us your feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience. Don't forget to sign up for the remaining 2 webinars taking place each Thursday during Walktober, and to visit the Maryland Department of Transportation website, which provides some other valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, educational opportunities, all at mdot.maryland.gov. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to the updates to learn more about the upcoming program. Next week's webinar is about education, teaching walking safety from a young age, featuring Safe Kids Worldwide President Torin Kreppe, as well as MDOT's Cynthia Spriggs and Dwan Morris, Safe Routes to Schools Coordinator for Montgomery County in Maryland. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. You take care now. Bye now.